My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor at Columbia School of International Public Affairs and director of the Center on Global Energy Policy there. I'm really delighted that Eirik Waerness and his colleagues from Statoil could be here today. This is Outlook season. The medium-term oil market report was out this morning, I think. Later this week, the Energy Center will be hosting Christoph Ruhl to really discuss BP's forecast. And it's always actually quite interesting and helpful at this time of year to look at how different people in EIA, IEA, and the industry see where we're headed in terms of the energy outlook. And so really delighted that Eirik was able to take time away from his schedule to be with us here today to present Statoil's views on that. Those of you who engage with a lot of the events we do on energy at Columbia know that his boss, Helge Lund, the CEO, was at Columbia not long ago, about a month or so ago, and gave a really fantastic talk on challenges facing the industry, from capital intensity to carbon intensity, and what it means to be a responsible operator, and also what they thought the outlook was for production in different parts of the world, including in North America. I'm not going to give sort of a long introduction of Eirik or the company. I think people know Statoil, but really quite a remarkably different company from one not long ago. I think Statoil formally listed on the stock exchange just over a decade ago and is a very different company today than it was a decade ago, growing from a company that was largely focused on producing Norway's offshore energy resources to a truly global oil and gas company with operations all around the world, expertise, unparalleled expertise in offshore development, and pretty massive projects in offshore Africa, in the Arctic and elsewhere around the world, and that has made North America a big focus for its potential future growth, and has entered the North American market and the shale market in a significant way, which why it makes it always interesting to have Statoil here, coming from the background they do, working under, in the Norwegian culture and in the Norwegian regulatory system, to talk about some of the challenges we face with energy development here in North America. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentation of the outlook today, and then having a conversation about it between us, and then opening it up to all of you, and to hear how this year's outlook compares to last year's, what's different about it, how it differs from some other outlooks, and also what's a little new and unique are some of the scenarios that are included in this year's outlook, and hopefully it'll be interesting to hear Eirik talk about some of those. So by way of that introduction, please join me in welcoming Eirik Waerness. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Glad to be back. Glad to be here. You're lucky. This year you get to see this 4 days after it was published. Last year it took a bit longer before we got to New York to present it. So it's fresh off the press. We've had a Norwegian launch and lots of Norwegian press coverage and interest around it. But you are the lucky first ones to listen to the presentation and our forecast outside of little Norway. In our Energy Perspectives publication, which I head up the work on, I work as chief economist in Statoil, but we have a big team, and my thanks go out to those guys who make that possible. In this perspectives, we'll look to 2040. Slightly longer than the IEA did in their last forecast. They might change their time horizon soon, and the same type of time horizon as the EIA does, and some of the other outlooks. ExxonMobil's outlook also goes to 2040. We forecast energy demand and energy mix, different regions. We use as our basis for the historical data the IEA data, and that gives us sort of a natural incline to use the IEA regions as the definitions in this. We do not do country by country forecasting, with the exception of the few countries that are separate regions in the IEA data, like Russia, India, and China. And we do energy demand, energy mix forecasting, and of course, just to state that, as you all know, when you forecast this long into the future, you're bound to be walking into uncertain territory and be relatively uncertain about the conclusions that you draw, at least on the specific details of the numbers in the forecast. This year's forecast contain not only a reference scenario, but also more details on two other alternative scenarios. which I'll spend quite a bit of time on when we go through the presentation, to cater for the uncertainty that I just mentioned, to take into account possible development trends that might develop differently, that might go in a different direction, based on things that we see today, but that might go in a different direction than what we think is most likely, which is what we have in our reference scenario. We have not assigned probabilities to these different scenarios, but realize that all the three and many other development paths in terms of energy demand, energy mix, and global economic development might be possible, even though what we describe in the reference scenario as our base case is what we think is most likely. If you're lazy and you just want to read one slide or one page, this is it. This is what the report contains. It's a lot about energy. That's the size of the letters, the size of the words here indicate how often they are mentioned in the publication. So it is about energy. It focuses on economic growth. That's why you see both economic and growth as large words here as drivers for energy demand, and different assumptions on economic growth will lead to different energy demand. It contains the word demand. There's more mentioning of demand than of supply in this report. And it mentions gas and oil because we're an oil and gas company, but it does mention other energy carriers as well. China has quite a big part of the publication, and I'll come back to why that is. The front page that I just showed you is a picture from China, by the way, and talking about energy demand to 2040, you cannot avoid talking about, you cannot avoid talking about China. As I mentioned, we have introduced a couple of different scenarios in addition to the reference case, so the word scenario is also repeated quite a bit. So that was the sort of the short version of the report. Yeah, I guess. Well, yeah, it is. It's surprisingly small, and I'll come back to why that is small. But it's if you look at, I guess if we have somewhere we will also talk about shale as tight. So maybe that's one of the reasons. But I'll come back to why shale is relatively small. So this page, or this shows the sort of the overall conclusions. Compared to last year's outlook, which was published a year ago, the changes to the reference scenario, the changes to the forecast in the reference scenario are very small. Our estimate for economic growth is roughly the same, slightly lower, but we've changed the base here, so the number is slightly higher. But we talk about and we forecast an economic growth which is relatively close to the historic average over the last 30 years. 3% average growth globally, 1.9% in the old OECD economies, and 4.5% in the non-OECD economies, leads to a global average of 3%. That means that the world as a whole will be 140% richer in 2040 than we are today. GDP in 2040 is 240% of what it is today, but we are about 30% more people that have to share that income. So the per capita income doesn't grow that much. We believe, as we did last year, that the non-OECD countries are catching up with the OECD countries, so they grow faster. As they grow as rich as we are, the difference in growth rates tapers off. So the non-OECD countries like China and in a while also like India will have growth rates that are much higher than we have here, but the difference will be smaller as we get closer to 2040, as they catch up with us. Per capita income in China will be almost as high as what is in Korea today in 2030. So they become a middle income country. Overall energy demand grows by 1.3%. So we're talking about significant improvements in energy intensity, significant lowering of the energy intensity of the global economy, improvements in energy efficiency. That means that 1.3% growth for 29 years means that we'll use about 35% more energy globally than today. And filling that energy demand with a sustainable mix is a substantial challenge. And in particular, when you look at where that demand growth is going to come, which is outside the OECD countries, and what type of energy supply those regions depend on. The indigenous supply in the regions of Asia is not sufficient in terms of oil and gas to deliver, but they have a lot of coal. So in order to make that energy mix sustainable, we have to make sure that we trade oil and gas with the regions that need it as they grow. We foresee, and you see that we expect oil and coal to grow at slightly lower rates, in particular oil, and gas grows faster. than overall energy demand and takes market share in the reference scenario. The energy mix as a whole is moderately greening. It would become more green faster if renewable energy was a larger share of the energy mix to start with. But it starts out at such a small share that even though we have a much higher growth rate in new renewables than any other source, 8% per year on average, which means that new renewables will be 10 times as large in terms of energy production in 2040 as today. But if it had been at a higher rate to start with, it would take greater space in the overall energy mix in 2040. But starting at that low a share means that it will not be sufficient to call the energy mix green in 2040. And as a consequence of both coal, oil, and gas growing, CO2 emissions grow in our reference case. And they grow until about 2030, when oil demand peaks and when the coal demand has been sufficiently tapered off to allow gas to grow, and then CO2 emissions falls off. As I said, long-term forecasts are uncertain, and we look at the moment that currently we are in a phase where at least three main sort of groups of uncertainties are affecting the sentiment and potentially might affect our long-term forecast to the extent that these trends are allowed to develop and become stronger. And issues of sustainability, issues about geopolitics, and issues about technological progress and technology challenges are drivers of the uncertainty around these forecasts. And if you sort of portray the development in different ways, you might get very different outcomes. In terms of sustainability, I have some pictures here just illustrating that. In terms of pollution in China, we have a climate conference, one of the UN conferences coming up next year. That we have allowed for, that of course affects the reference case. We believe in tougher climate and energy policies being developed, like the IEA does in their new policy scenario, but not sufficient to drive CO2 emissions significantly down. But we have allowed that uncertainty to sort of develop in a different direction in one of the alternative scenarios, which we call the low carbon scenario. There we play on the possibility of much tougher energy and climate policies being introduced quickly. The politicians of this world respond to increasing requests from their populations in order to do something about pollution. Both local pollution in China and other countries in Asia, but also more generally a worry about the consequences of climate change. And if that happens, you might foresee a different development. We do not think it is as likely as the reference scenario, but we think it is possible. And if you do that, we get a very different energy demand picture and energy mix and overall development, and also changes in the CO2 emissions. So we combine that with the technology uncertainty, which is illustrated by a couple of pictures in the middle, to generate a different scenario. On the left side, I have a couple of pictures illustrating some of the geopolitical issues that are going on at the moment, both in terms of US or North American energy independence, recently signed deal on gas between Russia and China, but also a lot of geopolitical unrest associated with the situation between Russia and Ukraine. As one example, we have the Middle East, North Africa, as we speak, illustrated about the uncertainty in Iraq. And you can foresee a different geopolitical development, a different climate in terms of negotiations, in terms of cooperation, protectionism versus energy security issues, etc. That could lead to a different scenario in terms of economic growth and thereby energy demand. And we've called that scenario policy paralysis. And that gives a world that is much poorer, much less conducive to economic integration and economic trade, more based on own domestic resources, and therefore also with a higher coal share in the energy mix, as an example. Less focus on a green climate policy. So that leads to a very different world in 2040 than the reference scenario. And we think that is also possible, even though much less likely than the reference scenario. So those are sort of some of the key uncertainties that we have used to develop these different scenarios. And that then sort of the consequence of that is, of course, yeah, we see that there is more than one possible future. And these two, I'll come back to this, but these two show some key indicators for how those scenarios play out. The left one shows what type of energy intensity, that is the energy used per dollar GDP that we have in the different scenarios. And the reference case here is in the middle. All three scenarios show a world that becomes more efficient in terms of energy use per GDP, but less so in the policy paralysis scenario than in the two other ones. The right chart shows CO2 emissions per unit of energy use. And there, of course, there's a moderate decrease in CO2 emissions, CO2 intensity, if you want it, in the two of the scenarios. But in the low carbon scenario, we have a significant improvement, which is a reflection of the energy mix in that scenario being much less CO2 intense than in the other scenarios. So per unit of energy use, CO2 emissions go faster down. The chart to the right here is the same as we had last year with updated data, of course. But we use this to illustrate that when you make global global energy forecasts to 2040, we have to take into account the very large impact on almost everything that we as economists are focusing on, following from the economic wonder in Asia. The economic point of gravity globally is moving back to where it was before the Industrial Revolution. The economic growth in the part of the world where most of the people live will affect trade with energy, consumption patterns, energy demand, all kinds of economic interaction also associated with energy differently than what we have been used to. And the consequence of that is that China will use almost as much energy in 2040 as all of OECD, which is both Japan, Australia, and the other OECD countries in Asia, all of Europe, and North America. Going from a share of global energy of around 11% in 2000 to 27% in 2040. More than half the global population lives less than 4,000 kilometers, or 2,500 miles from Hong Kong. That's what the chart to the left shows. And the impact of what's going on there on all our markets, it can almost not be underestimated. And when you add on to that this region is relatively energy poor, with the exception of coal, and to the extent that we're able to develop a lot of shale gas there at some point, then, of course, satisfying that growing region's energy demand is one of the key challenges for oil and gas companies, for regions like the Middle East, like Russia, like Central Asia, all the regions that have surplus of energy, and at some point, maybe even North America. Europe cannot exist because we are an energy deficit region as well, and the import deficit of oil in Europe in 2030 will be about the same as China. So Europe is not the solution in order to export energy to Asia. Europe will compete with Asia for some of this energy. But the rest of the world will have to step up to delivering energy to this region, especially if we want that to be sustainable, and avoid too high an increase in coal demand. And this 3 slides here sort of sums up how we get from our economic growth forecasts to overall energy demand. And as I mentioned, 3% overall global economic growth is what we have in our base case. It is distributed between different regions, as the chart on the left shows, where you have substantially higher growth in non-OECD Asia than in the OECD, and also higher than in the rest of the OECD, rest of the world, sorry. Moderate growth rates in the OECD area throughout the next first 5-year period, and then the next 2 decades. Note the tapering off of economic growth as we approach the 2030s and towards 2040, also in Asia. That has to do with assumptions on population, which affects the number of workers that are entering the workforce, and of course the population development in China, as an example, is a considerable challenge in terms of how much extra growth, extra production potential the economy will have when you go 5 to 10 years down the road. The size of the labor force at the moment is shrinking in China. Then you end up with either the contribution from capital or total factor productivity growth as the two main engines of growth. In a country like India, the situation is different. They have a population surplus still and a population growth that will contribute to high economic growth also into the 30s and 40s, as we think. So India, in percentage terms, will grow much faster than China in the 30s. The other reason for the tapering off, when you see it there, is what I mentioned in terms of the catch-up effect. As these countries become as rich as the average in the world, or even higher, there is a limit as to how much faster the total factor productivity can grow compared to in a country like the US. So therefore, you have this sort of this averaging out. The growth rates become more similar, and overall, then we have a 4% growth roughly in China in 2030s. And a 3% overall global growth from now and until 2040 globally. That translates to a gray line in the middle figure. That's the GDP growth globally. And then we run our models, do our assumptions about efficiency improvements, energy and climate policies, fuel mix changes, impact of relative prices, etc. And we get an energy intensity development, which is how much energy we use per unit of GDP. And that's the light blue line in the middle. And note that we presume, or the result of our assumptions and our modeling is that we'll return back to a trend, long-term trend of improving energy intensity, lowering energy intensity, which was the historical fact up to around 2000 globally. We use less energy per unit of GDP. Then over the last decade, that has flattened out, has not happened. And the reason is, in particular, the manufacturing growth associated with the economic growth in East Asia. But we believe that the current high energy prices, the energy policies in place, the maturation of some of these economies, etc., will lead to improving energy intensity going forward. And the globe will be 40% more energy efficient by the end of our forecasting period compared to what it is today. And that translates then into the dark blue line at the bottom, which is the energy demand growth globally globally. And you get back to the overall energy demand in the right chart, showing that we will use about 35–40% more energy in 2040 than we do today. And all the growth is outside the OECD. The OECD area we will have an energy intensity improvement, energy efficiency improvement, which is conducive to the 1.8–1.9% growth that we have in economic terms. So we will not use more energy even though the economy grows. But in the rest of the world, energy demand will grow. I'll show you a little bit more on how we have been reasoning in terms of developing these two alternative scenarios and I'll show that by our economic growth assumptions globally. We believe, because economic growth is a key driver for energy demand, and in order to get we have to realize that in order to have different development paths for energy demand and energy mix, we probably should also take into account the fact that our economic growth forecasts are uncertain. Here, this way of producing scenarios, alternative scenarios, is different in our forecast compared to what the IEA does. In the IEA scenarios, their current policy scenario, the new policy scenario, and the 450 ppm scenario all assume the same economic growth. We don't. So then the reasoning behind our low carbon scenario, which is the left chart there, is that we think it is more likely to have a climate for negotiations or a climate for policy making conducive to tougher energy and climate policies in a situation where economic growth is slightly higher than what we see now, especially in the OECD area. If you look at Europe, if Europe had been in a different situation after the financial crisis, there is reason to believe that there would be more power behind their energy and climate policies than we see today. So in a situation where we have slightly higher economic growth, we have more money in industries to do technological improvements, we have more tax money in governments to subsidize technological improvement, and we have a generally better climate for negotiation, sitting down at the table in Paris or the year after and quickly agree on something that really works. And that's what because in order to get to something close to the 2-degree development by 2040, something has to happen relatively quickly, and it's all about coordinated policies. It's about the big countries doing something together. It does not matter whether if the EU tightens their climate policies and nobody else does, it's not going to help. The UK's CO2 emissions have fallen by about 17% since the Kyoto Agreement was entered into. But the amount of CO2 that the Brits consume has increased by 19%. And the reason is the deindustrialization that generally goes on, so they've moved the production to China, and of course carbon leakage has also partly affected. So in order to get something that works, we need several large governments to sit down and agree. And it has to happen quickly. And we think that that might happen in a situation where you have higher economic growth to start with. Then, when we start introducing some of these climate policies, we start using new technology that is not perfectly mature, we will incur extra costs. There will not be that much revenue coming out of these investments in the start. So we think we will have slightly lower growth in this scenario, which, by the way, also will help our energy demand forecasts in a period until the green technology has taken foothold, until it has started to work, until we also, towards the end of the period, we probably also will have slightly lower climate costs, which also contributes to a higher economic growth. So we have slightly higher economic growth at the end. So we have, in this low carbon scenario, we have a growth trajectory that sort of oscillates around the trend in the reference scenario. And we end up with an economic growth or a GDP level globally that is the same in the low carbon scenario as in the reference scenario, but with very different energy mix and CO2 emissions, as I'll come back to. Policy paralysis scenario, that's where we take some of the signals of lack of geopolitical cooperation, increased conflict, higher arms race at some borders in the world, which is just the use of money and with no economic return, less economic trade, increased protectionism, focus on security of supply and thereby less trade with energy, etc. That leads to a situation with a much lower economic growth, which again leads to lower energy demand but less green energy demand. So there we have an average growth rate of 2.1% to 2040, which is then leads to which results in a GDP level which is significantly below what we have in the reference scenario. So the world, in a situation with increased conflict, the world will be a much less rich place in 2040 than we have today. And then this is a very complicated chart. The one on the right shows the overall level of energy demand and the mix in the three different scenarios globally. So the column to the left is how it looks, or how it looked in 2010. And then you have the three columns all the way out to the right is what this looks like in 2040. Higher energy demand in a reference scenario than in both of the other scenarios, much lower in the low carbon scenario than in both of the others. In the low carbon scenario, overall energy demand only grows by 4%. So we are 140% richer, but we only use 4% more energy. This is probably possible, but not very probable. But we think it can happen. But it does require what I was talking about, serious energy and policy measures of a very different kind than what we have seen so far globally. You can find signals of these types of energy policy measures in some countries, Norway being one of them, where we at the moment pay about $80 per ton of CO2 that we emit, whether you are in the oil and gas company or you are driving your gasoline-fueled car. But we don't find that very many other countries in the world. And then as a consequence of the different energy policies and the concerns driving energy demand, electrification, and all that, you get different energy mix also in the three scenarios, and the three bagels, or whatever you call them at the left. In Norway, it's smultring. Show the energy mix in the three scenarios. And you can compare them. And note that the coal share, which is the dark blue in the upper right of these three bagels, varies between 19% of the overall energy mix in the low carbon scenario to 32% in the policy paralysis scenario. Very different worlds in terms of how much coal we burn. We will still burn quite a bit of coal and still be at the low carbon scenario. But the difference is extreme, or not extreme, but it's very large. Currently, the coal share is 28%. So the coal share is stable in a reference scenario, goes considerably down in the low carbon scenario, and increases slightly in the policy paralysis scenario. And I'll highlight one. Note that the oil share is 25% roughly in all three scenarios. Currently, it's 31%. So the consequence of oil growing only at 0.6% per year in a reference scenario is that its market share goes down. Gas goes from 21% today to 23% in a reference scenario, 24% in a low carbon scenario. Slightly lower in the policy paralysis scenario. And then one of the big issues is, of course, how much can new renewables take What's the potential? And this is extremely uncertain. It has to do with technological development. It has to do with what you believe in terms of being able to introduce intermittent electricity production into large-scale energy systems and how much energy do you actually produce. One thing is the capacity, but it doesn't blow all the time. The sun does not always shine, at least not in Northern Europe, at least not in my hometown in Bergen, where it rains all the time. So how much energy can you produce with new renewables? We think it's going to grow by more than 10% for quite a period, but then gradually taper off. So the growth will taper off. So we believe 8% growth, roughly, per year. That means 10 times as much energy produced from windmills, solar panels, and geothermal plants. That takes the share from 1% this year, or now, to 6% globally. That's the gray sliver at the top of the left bagel in the reference scenario. In the low carbon scenario, it goes to almost 10% of overall energy. It looks small, but it's huge. In our reference scenario, we believe in order to make this happen, the world has to install 17,000 windmills of the largest kind, 7.5 megawatt, every year for 15 years. And they have to produce with a 30% efficiency. Today, the average is about 24, in order to deliver the wind part of that reference scenario. So the amount of money that has to go into this, into this global, extremely large energy system to deliver on that share of energy demand is considerable. And it's even more challenging than in the low carbon scenario, or if you want an even less carbon intensive energy mix in 2040. So this is not easy, but it's possible. But it has to do with policy changes and, of course, relative prices and so on. But it's huge. And the problem for the world, in a sense, is that renewables are such a low share of energy demand or an energy mix at the moment. Since I'm in the States, in the US, I'll show you what we have for OECD North America in the same type of chart, more or less. Note that overall energy demand is lower than today in all scenarios. As I said, OECD energy demand will not grow, we think. We have higher gas share in all scenarios. There's a lot of cheap gas at the moment in North America, and you should use it. So the gas share of overall energy mix will go up. The consequence of that is, of course, that the CO2 emissions will come down compared to a scenario where you use more coal. We have lower oil demand, 10 percentage point reduction in the oil share from 2010 to 2040 in the reference scenario. New renewables here grow from almost nothing to about 9%. So it's the same type of development as in the world, but more. You get more bang for the buck here in terms of changes in the mix, since the overall energy demand doesn't grow. And if you look at the low carbon scenario, the overall energy demand goes down by 1.3% per year. So that the overall energy demand at the end here is only 2/3 of what it will be what it would be in the reference scenario. And that is also no small feat. That's a challenge, but it could happen. One major big conclusion is that fossil fuels are here to stay. And as I said, in terms of how much it takes to increase the renewable share of the energy mix from 1% to 8%, we need fossil fuels in all scenarios. In the reference scenario, which I saw the big area charts here, oil demand grows to about 2030, then peaks as the transportation sector in emerging economies is starting to mature, and that is and the energy demand growth there is counteracted by the transportation sector being very mature and electrified in the OECD area. So the oil demand peaks around 2030. But still, oil demand in 2040 is significantly higher than today, globally. Gas demand on the right chart grows throughout the period and grows faster than overall energy demand, so we'll use much more gas in 2040 than today. But if you go then to the alternative scenarios, we have these dots in the chart, and in particular, look on the left chart, you see the low carbon oil demand, and the oil demand in the low carbon scenario will be about 70 million barrels per day. That is 2.5 times as much as Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US produces today. It is much more than can possibly be produced by existing reserves, existing resources. So in terms of investments in oil and gas, the absolute level of demand is not that important. And what is important is the difference between any given level of demand in any scenario and what you think you can produce from existing reserves, existing fields. And that difference is big. IEA just came out with a report indicating that about 22 million barrels per day is what you can produce from existing fields. That means we have to add almost 50 million barrels per day, even in the low carbon scenario, from something that is not producing today. It's either by developing new reserves from the resources that are in those fields, existing fields, IOR, or we have to discover, first explore, then discover, then develop, and then produce. It's a significant challenge. It requires a lot of investments. 80% of the estimated investments in oil and gas until 2035 is just to keep production at current levels. So even if we think that the world goes towards the low carbon scenario, we need a lot of investments in oil and gas. Fossil fuels are here to stay. A little bit about where the oil comes from. This is the global oil supplies, and this is where I try to put the shale revolution in context, in particular the tight oil, or the shale revolution in context. You note the US shale revolution. It's part of what is called non-OPEC tight oil. It's the purple area, second from the top in the left chart. That's where the increase here in terms of shale oil is contributing to non-OPEC oil production not decreasing. It's contributing to this bump that we have in non-OPEC production going forward, together with oil sands, which is at the top. And then going forward into the future, we also have shale oil or tight oil in some other regions, but relatively moderate. The technology used in shale oil or tight oil production is also contributing to limiting the decline on conventional crude non-OPEC, which is the gray area at the bottom of the left chart. But still, this chart shows that there are a lot of other uncertainties to determining the fate of the global oil market going forward. Tight oil is one important factor, but there are very many other uncertainties of the same or larger scale. Iraq is one. The potential production from Iraq could be, the forecast for production in Iraq could be either 1 or 6, 7, 8 million barrels per day once you get into the 2020, mid-20s and onwards. So the range of uncertainty in Iraq is larger than the peak we predict for tight oil production in the US, which is 5 million barrels per day. How much Saudi Arabia can produce is uncertain. In our baseline forecast, they will be challenged until about 2025 because the global oil demand is not sufficient to increase coal on OPEC, given the non-OPEC production. And to cater for an increase in Iraq, Saudi Arabia have to limit their production. By 2025, the OPEC market share starts to increase again, and they can come back up to some 9, 10 million barrels per day. But whether Saudi Arabia can produce 12, 8, or 14 in 2035, there are probably people in Saudi Arabia who know that, but I don't. So it's a big uncertainty. Russia currently produces around 10 million barrels per day. How long that can continue? What happens when they start producing their shale resources, which are formidable, but located in the world's largest swamp? They can only produce half a year. What happens if they go into the Arctic? Big uncertainty. So there's a lot of uncertainties around these oil forecasts, and tight oil has contributed to the non-OPEC production increase, but it's not the only thing that matters. Then I'll end on a note with the CO2 emissions, and I'll do 4 charts, 1 on the world and 3 regions. The CO2 emissions globally is the one in the left for the 3 different scenarios, and we have also added in the IEA new policy scenario and the IEA 450 ppm scenario in 2035. And you see that our reference case is slightly higher than IEA's new policy scenario. That has mostly to do with China, and I'll come back to that, or assumptions on China. Then we have the low carbon scenario, which is sort of aimed at looking at the impact of something that, or a policy change and a technological improvement guided at or directed at getting the emissions down, making us more energy efficient. We have not done the goal seek of saying IEA knows the answer to what limits the temperature increase to 2 degrees by 50% probability and then sort of calculate it back. We've not done that. But we have changed the assumptions in terms of economic growth, in terms of energy and climate policies, in terms of energy efficiency, looked at what do we think can be done, and then we get this result. And you see that the light blue line passes slightly higher than IEA's 450 ppm figure in 2035. So, but we're on a trajectory. CO2 emissions are declining rapidly during that period. Part of it is also driven by CCS, which we have introduced more in the low carbon scenario than in the reference scenario. By the way, we're less optimistic on carbon capture and storage in this year's reference scenario than we were last year. It will take longer than we thought last year. I think we were overly optimistic. With the hindsight of 1 year, we were overly optimistic last year. But there will be CCS taking out 10% of the remaining CO2 emissions from power production globally in the low carbon scenario. That's some billion tons. But we're higher than the IEA. Look at the OECD North America first. CO2 emissions will go down as the energy mix changes, as the energy demand does not grow, and you go from coal to gas. It will go down in all scenarios, and here we are spot on the level of CO2 emissions as the IEA came out with. By coincidence, by the way, but we are spot on. So for the OECD area, our low carbon scenario here is on our way to the 2-degree trajectory presented by IEA. And it goes, the same goes for Europe, the left chart in this one. Where we are not exactly there is, for example, in China or in some of the other emerging economies. Our CO2 emissions in China are higher than the IEA has presented, both in the reference scenario and also in our low carbon scenario. There are two reasons for that, and that is that we are less optimistic than the IEA in terms of what can be achieved in terms of reducing energy intensity, improving energy efficiency in China. We have roughly the same economic growth rate. And we're also slightly less optimistic. That might be wrong, but we're slightly less optimistic in terms of how quickly you can dampen the growth in coal demand in China. The flip side of that is that IEA, in our view, are overly, I don't know if you can use the word, but they're overly optimistic in terms of nuclear power growth in China. They have much more nuclear power in China, which of course limits CO2 emissions, but has some other implications as well. So there are some significant differences in our forecast for Chinese energy use that's the main explanation why our CO2 emissions vary slightly from those of the IEA globally. And then we have also this year introduced some maps at the beginning of the report, and I thought I'd just show you one. Here's where it's just to illustrate that what we're doing here is we're forecasting for a long period to 2040 for many regions and countries, the globe, split into 12 regions plus international bunkers, which has no regional affiliation, and with a series of fuels. So when we do this, what sort of the goal that we set for ourselves is a goal that was attributed to John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist, but wrongly, we think. It's a British philosopher called Carveth Reid who has said this, and that's that we hope to be vaguely right rather than precisely wrong. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eirik. That was a great, really comprehensive overview of where we're headed on energy. So We have about 30 or 40 minutes for discussion and questions. Let me ask, I'll sort of kick it off and ask a couple of questions and then open it up to everyone here. I wanted to start, if I could, just by making sure I understood the low carbon scenario. And so, as you said, this was not, someone might look at the low carbon scenario, might look at the conclusion fossil fuels are here to stay, and someone might say, well, it's fine for you to say that, but that means we're all in trouble and the planet can't handle it, right? So if that's the view, if you start from the premise that there's a certain concentration target that needs to be hit or else we're all in a lot of trouble, maybe people feel that, maybe not, but let's assume that for the moment. I'm just wondering how you back into that from the numbers you have. It looks like IEA says here's what it takes to hit 450 part per million, and you are consistent with that in your outlook, your scenarios everywhere except China for the most part,
in
right?
OECD.
OECD.
Not in the emerging economies.
Right, okay. And so when the conclusion, I just want to be clear, the conclusion that fossil fuels are going to remain a dominant source of energy for decades to come, even if we put in place policies that reduce carbon and do something about climate change that needs to be done, that's true. There's a difference in the non-OECD, but even accounting for that difference, that's still largely correct. Is that right? I just want to make sure I understand it. Or I guess the other way to say it is if you said, okay, I need to revise whatever I think is going to happen in the non-OECD to keep us below 450, does that change the numbers very significantly or not? You get a little bit less fossil fuels, but it's still the dominant source of energy for decades to come. Maybe that's the other way to ask the question.
Yeah. I mean, even if the answer to the last question is yes. I mean, even if you say that we have to get even lower on global CO2 emissions. First of all, the CO2 emissions in any given year is a very imprecise indicator of any kind of temperature increase by 2100. It's the trajectory that matters. It's where we go in terms of accumulation, and IPCC changed the link between any given CO2 emission accumulation and the temperature increase from the previous report to this report. So we're talking about something that is very vague. But the point is we have to get it down in order to limit the temperature increase. And even if we were to change the assumptions, either by economic growth or energy intensity or fuel mix, technological changes, so that we get the CO2 emissions down even further, still oil and gas are here to stay, fossil fuels. And let's hope that it's as much oil and gas as possible and as less coal as possible within that framework. And that has to do with policies as well, because if we have more coal in this, we get higher CO2 emissions per unit of energy used, which means that we, within this framework, have to manage with less energy. So if we're to maximize the use of energy within any given limit on CO2 emissions, we have to make sure that we get coal consumption as low as possible and gas consumption as high as possible within that fossil fuel mix that there is room for. And the reason why I say that fossil fuels are here to stay no matter what is first of all, in the 2-degree scenario that the IEA presented, gas consumption is about 20% higher than today, globally. That means that there's a lot of oil and gas investments, or gas investments that have to be made in order to make that possible. Oil consumption is about 15 to 20% lower. But as I said, the decline rates are such that we have to invest tremendous amounts of money to get 70 million barrels per day out of the ground, or if it were 60, or if it were 80. Currently, Saudi Arabia produces about 10 million barrels per day. So do you, and so does Russia. That's 30 together. Just to invest to keep that production is tremendous. It's a tremendous challenge for us. And then we have to add on 30 more from somewhere. So fossil fuels are here to stay. And let's hope it's gas, oil, and not coal.
Got it. So yeah, again, to be clear on that, because sometimes, again, you hear a conclusion like that, and particularly when it's presented from an analyst for an oil and gas company, and people sort of say, well, it's fine to say that, but that's just not acceptable, or we have to change it. But if the changes were driven not by economic growth or technology, but by policy, right? The world tomorrow all gets together in a room, and kumbaya, we decide that we have to cap emissions at 450, and that's it. Policy says you can't go over 450. Even in that world, we're still dominated by fossil fuels for the next 30 years.
Yeah,
Is that right?
Between 60% and 2/3 of overall energy demand will be fossil fuel.
And that's consistent with the IEA 450 part per million scenario, which finds fossil fuels going from 80% of the energy mix in the reference case to 65% roughly in the 450 case.
And then the share will go down.
And then it keeps going.
I mean, if we roll this out to 2050 or 2060, and you still believe in the 450 or whatever concentration level, then the share will go down.
And I had
but we're on a trajectory where that goes down.
And I had thought part of the reason they continued to play such a large role in the IEA mix was because of aggressive assumptions on CCS. But you're saying that's not the case. You're actually pessimistic a little bit on CCS, but it still plays a big role.
And if I remember correctly, I think what we had in our base case last year in terms of CCS was the same as the IEA has in its 450 ppm scenario. That means, which means they might have changed it in this year's World Energy Outlook, but if I think they take out about 2.5 billion tons of CO2 in their 450 ppm due to CCS, 2.5 out of 22 billion. So they reduce emissions by about 10% in the 2 degree scenario. The rest of the reduction from some 38 to 22 is energy efficiency, lower energy demand, et cetera, and changes in fuel mix, of course, electrification and moving from coal to gas. And so on. And 2.5 billion tons is more than we have now. It is a considerable challenge. That is 2,500 plants of the same size as the one we are testing for, or we're testing for in Norway. Mm-hmm. It's 2,500 plants where you take out 1 million tons on each plant, and the investments around that is, it's not only capture, it's transportation of gas, a lot of gas, and it's storage. So it's no small feat.
So I was looking at the IEA's medium-term oil market report that came out this morning quickly before coming here, and they are a little more optimistic than they were before on how quickly shale could be replicated elsewhere. I know I kind of joked in them when you started that the word shale was really small in there's like a word for those picture things.
Yeah,
the words. I forget what it's called.
Yeah, Wordle.
So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you think the outlook for shale outside North America is. Are you increasingly optimistic, increasingly pessimistic, and what are the biggest challenges, both below ground and above ground, to making that happen?
Well, I think we're moderately optimistic, I should say, in terms of shale elsewhere. On oil, on gas, there will be shale gas in China, in particular, because they need the gas. They need all the gas they can get, and they will try. As far as we understand, the geology is different. It's much deeper. It's in an earthquake area, so these faults, geological faults, are different. So the technology might be different. But we think it will come, but it will be moderate, and it won't see the same type of speed in development as you've seen here, partly because of above ground things and lack of infrastructure and those types of. You don't have the type of dynamic environment of actors doing that you have here, from mom and pop garage type of companies to the ExxonMobils. It's a different set of companies which indicates that the development will be slower. In terms of shale oil, we have shale oil coming out of Russia in our forecasts. There's a balance there between how much oil does the world need, right? I mean, and it's a cost level, and if you have more shale coming out of Russia, you might have less Arctic oil coming out of Russia. So there's also a competition between different type of technologies and areas, and that is a cost decision. If it proves to be possible to produce shale oil out of the reserves in Western Siberia at much lower cost than the Arctic, then you could see Arctic being postponed compared to some other people's forecasts. But we have shale oil in Europe, very low production increase from a very low forecasts for shale gas and oil. One of the reasons being that Europe is a very different area than the US. It's heavily populated. The biggest potential source of shale, tight oil in Europe is underneath Paris. And to imagine drilling in Paris next to the Eiffel Tower is difficult. Framework conditions are different. The type of actors are different, et cetera, et cetera. The good thing about North Dakota is that there are two things about North Dakota, or three. I guess there's oil, there's Norwegians, and there are not a lot of them. So it's easy to drill and get production up, right?
So just for the record, not a lot, not Norwegians, but not a lot of them. Those are good things.
Yeah. That's good things if you want to put in place a lot of rigs and you want something done.
Okay. I want to ask you about, you mentioned sort of OPEC and Saudi Arabia. You know, some of the recent analyses, the World Energy Outlook from the IEA and others sort of showed pressure being placed on OPEC's ability, need to coordinate production, that there's going to be a lot of non-OPEC supply coming online that is going to put downward pressure on price unless they can put a lot in spare capacity. And then, some period of time after that, 5 or 10 years later, like we're going to need that supply, but in the medium term, there's going to be pressure on OPEC to pull supply off the market or really see some downward movement in prices. I know you're not going to predict prices, but what do you see for sort of spare capacity and for the call on OPEC?
No, over the next couple of years. I guess I should say that we finished the data and the analysis of this slightly before the recent developments in Iraq. But for the short to medium term, we see an increase in OPEC's spare capacity because demand growth is relatively limited, and we have this non-OPEC increase in production. But that assumes that countries like Libya comes in. Not at full capacity, but at higher capacity than they have at the moment, and that's uncertain. And then you get Iraq, where the recent developments will probably delay the production increase that everybody has for Iraq, and that will also then result in a slightly smaller slower increase in OPEC production capacity. But we foresee generally that OPEC spare capacity will increase over the next couple of years.
What does it rise to?
From 2 to some close to 5 million barrels within 2 to 3 years is what we have in our baseline. But that assumes, as I said, Libya.
Yeah, right.
There's also an uncertainty about Iran, what the sanctions in Iran, and what Iran's production capacity really is if the sanctions were to be lifted. We have Nigeria, we have South Sudan, we have Syria. You always have some supply outage, and how that plays in. Generally, that leads to a period of slightly lower prices, but it's how much depends on what type of environment you have around it all the time.
And can you talk a little bit more about Iraq, just to bring it to timely topics? The medium-term report this morning had them going up to, I think, 4.5 by 2019. Baghdad has a number of 8 or 9 million. There's, as you said, a lot of numbers out there. Before last week, what was your thinking on where Iraq was headed in terms of how much production it could bring online? And then, has that changed in the last few days?
No, yeah, we're relatively close to the OPEC figure you referred to, some 4.5 million barrels per day by around 2020, if I recall correctly. I'm not, but it's so a relatively moderate increase and far away from the targets of the government, and of course that can be delayed. I guess what is clear is that Iraq has a lot of oil, and nobody has explored for oil. So it's probably has more oil than people think, as well. But you have to get it out and you have to produce it, and the conditions at the moment are not very conducive to that type of development. So, and also it's an issue there between the different key countries in OPEC as to how you distribute the production in a situation where the call on OPEC does not grow, which is what we have in our forecast, right? So because allowing Iraqi production to grow substantially, if that were possible, would lead some other countries in OPEC to have to modify their production, and that might be an issue.
And when we talk about oil and gas production, there's this sort of narrative, maybe more in North America than elsewhere, is this shift from scarcity to abundance. Like, it's a very different outlook now. And notwithstanding all that talk of abundance, oil is very expensive right now, historically speaking, even adjusted for inflation. And Helge again talked about capital intensity challenges when he was at Columbia not long ago. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of what that means. Are we just in a period of time now where, yes, there's a lot of hydrocarbons in the world, but the incremental cost of pulling the new supply out of the ground is just really expensive, and we're sort of in an era of just structurally higher energy prices because this is what it costs to go into the very challenging areas that companies like Statoil go into.
Yeah, fundamentally, I think that we are. If you look at sort of the long-run marginal cost, we are in a situation where what we do is more challenging now than it was 10, 15 years ago. The increase in oil demand coming out of the economic growth miracle in Asia and in China in particular over the last decade moved oil demand quicker than many people expected, which also meant that we ended up on a part of the supply curve that is steeper than what we thought. And when you drill for oil at 2,500 meters sea depth, and then what you find is 3,000 meters below the seabed, and what you find is relatively heavy oil, which you more or less have to blow out or suck out. What we're talking about is technologically on the limit of what we can do, and that's what we're doing. And when we look for oil in the Arctic, it is expensive. When you look for, when you try to produce the oil in the fantastically large Kashagan field in shallow waters in the Caspian, which people have waited for 15 years, it proves to be very expensive for different reasons. So there are fundamentally, I think we are on a much higher cost level than we were 15 years ago, which is an indication that the long-term oil price will be much higher over the next 30 years than it has been over the last 30. Over the last 30, it's been about $55 per barrel, real terms, some 50 something. It will be much higher from there. Then you have some business cycle issues that probably contributes to a high cost level at the moment. And that is the other part of the demand increase from China and other emerging economies, is that the price of labor, the price of steel, the price of cement, the price of all kinds of resources that we use in this industry have gone up. That could be more of a business cycle phenomenon. The price of rigs have gone up. We see now that the rig rates are coming down as the IOCs signal some kind of slowing down of their investment profiles. So there's an element of both at the moment. But fundamentally, we're at a much higher long-run marginal cost level than we thought in 1999 when the price was $10. But there are some business cycle elements. An Indian engineer makes about 3 times as much as he or she did 10 years ago, which is very good for them. But there might be a business cycle element that could reduce the cost level somewhat.
And the other question that comes up is not just prices have been high, but they've been remarkably stable. And is there a new structural era of reduced volatility? You mentioned last year when you presented at Columbia the interesting thought that the U.S. could be the new swing supplier because shale can be ramped up and down much more quickly, not driven by political decisions like some OPEC producers, but just the economics that if price drops 15 or 20 bucks, you idle your rig and then you bring it back, and it's different for unconventional because you got to keep the decline rates are steep and you need to continue the shale activity so rapidly. Is that a piece of it? Is that part of what contributes to stability? Do you think there is something different about the oil world we live in today that leads to more price stability?
Yeah, I think it's part of it is with price stability at a high level, right? I mean, one thing is that the price for delivery of oil in 2017 has been at $90 now for almost 3 years. And so it's been completely stable. And then you've had the spot prices above, which have also been relatively stable, at least for 18 months. And so the actors in the industry seem to believe that the marginal cost of oil delivered is about $90. That is sort of, which means it's some oil sands and it's some shale and whatever. And then the spot price being stable above that is probably partly because the underlying price level has been stable, but it's also partly because we've had a series of sequential supply disruptions and geopolitical concerns that add on to that and lifts the price by $15 to $20. If all these supply concerns or supply disruptions had come at the same time, we would have had prices much spiking and falling. So it's also a matter of coincidence. And I also think that, it makes me happy to hear that Adam Szymiński said more or less the same yesterday, that the tight oil revolution or the shale industry in the U.S. probably contributes as an extra spare capacity in terms of dampening volatility of prices. But I think we agree that it's most relevant in terms of price falls, because that's when the industry can react really quickly. Is when the price falls, you can stop drilling. The reaction time is slightly longer for a price increase when you have to put in place new rigs or move rigs out of gas and into oil and so on. But there is an element of an extra buffer there where the tight oil industry helps in terms of price volatility.
Let me ask a last question. And while I'm doing that, people raise your hand so we can get a mic to you, and then we'll open it up after this question. So if anyone has a question, just raise your hand now. I wanted to ask you about the outlook for the LNG market. It's a little bit tight right now. People see it loosening up considerably as the U.S. and Australia and other supplies come online. What's your sense of where the LNG market is headed? And again, without forecasting prices, but just more broadly, the questions that are raised about the future of global gas price integration. Are we going to see weakening of the oil linkage? Kind of how do you think that'll play out?
Yeah, we foresee that the global gas markets, which are currently many, and three main regions, they will gradually be interlinked by LNG. LNG will grow in its role, but it's still only 12% of overall gas is put on a keel and transported as LNG. That market will grow, will contribute to increased integration between the markets. We agree with the IEA that to the extent that the U.S. now starts exporting LNG, we're a bit uncertain how much it has to be, but some LNG exports out of the U.S. or Western Canada will provide a link from the Henry Hub price here to the regional spot prices, both in Asia and in Europe. That does not mean, as some politicians might in Europe have argued, as if that would lead to Henry Hub pricing in Europe. It will not. Because
politicians here argue it'll lead to Japanese pricing here.
Yeah, there are some transportation costs and liquefaction costs and regasification costs in between there that has to be satisfied. But you'll get a link, and that will affect both the price behavior probably in Europe, both on the customer or on the demand and supply side, and the same thing in Asia. So you'll get a link. You will not get equal prices. Increased demand or increased availability of LNG should lead to a larger increase of spot pricing also in Asia. In Europe, we're there. It's spot pricing, and with very small price differentials between the different terminals as well. But in Asia, you should have that. But of course, the Asian gas market is tremendously challenging and tremendously exciting for somebody who's in the gas business. We're talking about an increase in gas demand from now to 2040 of the size of a new Europe in terms of gas demand. And the Russians will continue to deliver gas, as they have proven, and so will the Central Asians, and so will the Australians. Some of the LNG projects that are online now are not very cheap, right? So there's also, you need a certain gas price to be able to deliver gas, or at least to be able to profitably make the gas. We think, as a consequence of that, we also think that not all the planned or proposed or thought about LNG projects here will be realized, far from so, but there will be some LNG exports.
And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on European energy security and the future of its gas policy there, given what's happening in Russia, not to mention renewables and nuclear and lots of other things I didn't have a chance to ask about, but hopefully others will. So we'll open up. We have about 20 minutes for questions in the back.
Make any generalizations about United States?
Can folks identify, just introduce yourself briefly?
My name is Craig Rosenthal. I'm an individual investor.
Thank you.
Can you make any generalizations about United States-based natural gas producers who do their drilling exclusively within the United States, don't export? If they're depressed now because of the price of natural gas, how do you see it in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I guess the general message would be that we think that over time the gas prices in the U.S. will creep upwards. It has to do with drilling the sweet spots first, slightly more costly, slightly less prolific wells being drilled after a while. Issues like some producers being challenged financially as well will lead to prices necessarily being higher over time. There might be some environmental regulations put in place over time that also could lift the prices somewhat. Wouldn't help the profitability of the producer, but would lead to slightly higher prices. So gradually, but on the other hand, what has been been a realization, I guess, is that every time somebody looks at it, it looks like the resource base is larger than what we thought a couple of years ago, and can be produced at current cost levels, whether it's $4 or $5 or $6 per MMBTU, in larger quantities than we thought. So there's a balance there, and I think the jury is still out as to how much that will lead to in terms of an increase. And if you look at different forecasters, we don't agree, right? Some think it's going to be flat forever, But most forecasters, I would say that I've looked at least, believe in some increase in terms of the long-term gas prices 3-4 years from now and onwards.
Okay. In the front and then second table.
Thank you. Michael Dobson from the New School. I had a question. I noticed that one of the drivers of higher economic growth you identified in the low carbon scenario in the 2040s was a reduced climate costs relative to the reference case. And I'm just interested in how you guys accounted for climate costs in the modelling. If you could speak a little about that. Yeah.
Well, we don't account for climate costs explicitly in our current forecast or in the model, because one of the reasons, well, first of all, it's difficult to do that, and it's only one element that affects economic growth going forward. Secondly, 2040 is it's very long, but it's too short in terms of climate costs being very visible. Most of the climate costs, if we get them after 2040. But one of the things that could drive growth slightly higher or contribute to growth being slightly higher in the low carbon scenario, in addition to all the other elements, technology and more efficient ways of economic interaction, because we remove all fuel subsidies, for instance, in the low carbon scenario. We do not do that in the reference scenario. That contributes to higher growth as well. But one of the things would be that if we get some elements of global climate costs implicitly in our growth rates in the reference scenario, could be 0.1% per year or during the last decade or something, that will be slightly lower given that some of these technologies start to work. But it's a very, very small figure, because most of the things that we do now in terms of reducing CO2 emissions will not have an impact on climate costs until after our forecast period.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Eirik, and your team for a great job. It's really fascinating. I enjoyed very much when I read.
Thank you.
My question is, I'm not a politician, yes, but what do you think about political paralysis scenario? Should we create or improved a new formula regarding about that? Because we have seen recently a lot of tremendous challenges for global energy security, like a real war between Ukraine and Russia, like crisis in North Iraq, like crisis between Japan and China, etc. Thank you.
Well, I think our reference scenario is what we feel or what we think is the most likely scenario. And in that scenario, you could describe that that scenario starts now and goes to 2040, right? And currently, we see a lot of challenges, both supply disruptions, crisis in the Middle East, et cetera, geopolitical issues. And then we take the most serious consequences of those types of issues, we take those out of the forecast, which means that we have some kind of a rationality prevails type of look upon the world. So some of these crises, they go over. It takes about a year or two, and then we're back to business, and so on. So that's the sort of the framework of how we and others make these long-term forecasts. Then what we've done in the policy paralysis scenario is that what if they don't go away immediately? That we get not a permanent, but sort of we get a level of conflict that permanently repeats itself. It might not be the same conflict all the time, but it permanently repeats itself. So that you have an increased arms race, in a sense, which is one consequence. You have more military buildup at borders, increased conflict, increased supply disruptions because of local or regional conflicts, etc. We cannot exclude that to happen. Part of it could be that also because of the sort of the rebalancing of the global powers, going from a one polar world where the U.S. is the one single superpower in the world after 1991, to a situation where you have to balance that with different powers, where China has grown up so big that it also wants an international position that is different than the one it has had, and the same with Russia. And in that period, you get increased uncertainty, not necessarily that much conflict, but you get increased uncertainty about how to react and act together, and you get, in a sense, inefficient investments in different types of things, or you don't cooperate as well on international trade. Consumption patterns don't go that way. Then you get lower growth. And that's what we have developed in this scenario. If you look at it on the face of it, it might be very unrealistic that it should last so long, that you get a 2.1% growth instead of a 3% until 2040. Right? So much lower growth going forward. But to take that, I mean, we've had a couple of decades going back. We've had a couple of decades with significantly lower growth than what we've seen over the last decade. Like, I mean, if you take the 80s, for instance. So it might happen at least over a decade or two, and then we're very close to taking it all the way to 2040. And if you notice, we had growth picking up towards the end, so that it relatively closer to the base case. So kind of that reasoning behind it, and no specific mentioning of any type of conflict. It's more sort of a world that is less conducive to cooperation. Something that people my age remember, if we think about it. It's been a while, but we do remember that type of part of that type of world still. We do.
Time for one or two more questions. Are there any other? Yeah, right over here, please.
Hi. I'm Yaver Heriker. I'm a student at CEPA, Columbia University. I have an observation as well as a question. My first observation is that I totally agree with you that fossil fuels are here to stay. And the reason why I think that's the question, that's an observation, is because of the energy mix that's currently prevailing. My question is, I'm Pakistani, and we have rolling blackouts. Our energy mix is skewed towards oil and gas, but we have a lot of undiscovered coal. We have a lot of like unearthed coal, which could be our main source of energy for the future. So my question is, what is a country like Pakistan, where it comes from that region, comes from the South Asia region with China and India, where you have a majority of the population? What's it supposed to do when you have oil, which hypothetically takes about 16 cents to produce a megawatt of energy, compared to coal, which is much cheaper, could be dirtier, but much cheaper, say 6 cents per megawatt of energy. So what's a country like Pakistan supposed to do in such a scenario where you have multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the IFC refusing to finance their coal excavation? So my question is that what are we supposed to do when we can't, of course, afford oil and gas and renewables and gas is running out? Thank you.
That's a question that is extremely difficult for someone who sits on a lot of oil and gas to answer. But I think you point out the one of the biggest issues that are facing us in terms of having a sensible discussion about how to achieve anything like the 2-degree scenario. And if you look at it from the way we discuss it in the West, it's as if as long as we get our CO2 emissions down, this is going to fix itself. But what we're talking about here is both allowing a country like Pakistan to develop its own resources, and if that is coal, well then there might be some room for that coal in a mix where we reduce coal demand or coal production elsewhere, where we can afford to do it, be it in North America or in Europe. In Europe, currently, we go the other way, right? We develop our own coal resources combined with renewables because coal is so cheap. And CO2 emissions slightly increase, and we reduce our gas demand. And then we should make gas available for a country like Pakistan at competitive conditions, if that is possible. So all kinds of gas resources that could be developed at sensible costs globally should be made available either to Pakistan or India or China or whatever at competitive prices. And then finally, I mean, at some point, it also boils. Fortunately, we have in place things like joint implementation and measures where the rich countries of the world pay for CO2 reductions in the rest of the world, in other parts of the world. And I think we will not come, in order to achieve a 2-degree scenario, we'll have to go that way as well. Whether it's finding out together with I mean, most of the smart people in the world are within that same circle, as I showed on the. I mean, That's where at least half the world's good ideas occur in that region, right? So if we can do that together if we can do these technological solutions together, then the CCS development, when it comes, has to be in the regions where the coal use is increasing, and that's going to be Southeast Asia. Both Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, India will probably have a tendency to increase their coal use. And if that's the case, that's where the CCS plants should be as well. So it's a combination of measures, I think.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, an important policy issue. As you said, the World Bank and many governments, including the U.S., have a position of not supporting loan guarantees and support for new coal plants, even in places that have real severe blackout and other challenges. I think we have time for one last question, if there is one. If not, we can let everyone go a few minutes early. Yeah, last question in the back.
My name is Sung-Yuk Kim. I'm working at Korean Consulate. I'm from South Korea. You didn't talk much about nuclear energy. How do you think the nuclear energy will play out in the future energy mix? That's my question.
We are, I guess it will play a role. It will play a significantly increasing role in countries in emerging Asia. But we don't foresee the nuclear growth being, much higher than the overall energy demand growth globally. So, and in regions like in Europe, I think we have a roughly stable production of nuclear energy, which means that the countries that will phase out nuclear energy, like Germany and Sweden, they will be compensated by their neighbors, France and Finland, increasing and selling the electricity to their neighbors instead. But we have a moderate growth in nuclear energy in North America as well, as far as I remember, but roughly in line with the forecast. It is one of the biggest uncertainties in our forecast as well on the technological side. I think, and in a situation where global climate concerns come to the fore, nuclear energy might actually play a bigger role, and get a bigger role, being induced. But there are cost issues around it, storage issues, and there's also, at some point, I guess, there's also a resource issue with nuclear energy as well. But moderately optimistic. And as far as I recall, yeah, we have the same market share roughly in the reference scenario as we have today, which means it grows in line with overall energy demand. But in the low carbon scenario, we have a slightly higher share, which means it grows faster than, or it grows slightly also in the low carbon scenario when energy demand doesn't grow.
Great. Well, I really want to thank Eirik for being here. Given the difference I felt between the absolutely perfect weather in Oslo this weekend with sun until midnight and the humidity outside, we want to let you get back to that beautiful weather as quickly as possible. But really appreciate your coming to New York this week and presenting your perspective on where the energy world is headed today. And for those of you who can't get enough of this, BP's chief economist Christoph Ruhl will be here on Thursday around lunchtime for a similar conversation. But please join me in thanking Eirik Waerness. Thank you.
Thank you.